The holographic display filled the command center with cold blue light as Jake Morrison stared at the images that would change everything humanity knew about its place in the universe. The reptilian figure on the screen stood 3 meters tall with scales that seemed to absorb light itself, and eyes that burned with an intelligence both ancient and terrible. Warlord Kazrath had conquered 47 star systems in 300 years, and now his fleet was turning toward Earth. Admiral Linda Carter stood beside Jake with her hands clasped behind her back in a posture that spoke of military discipline, even as her jaw tightened with barely controlled fear. She had seen the reports from every civilization that had faced Kazrath, and the pattern was always the same. First came the demands for surrender, then came the demonstrations of power. Finally came the choice between submission or total destruction. No species had ever chosen to fight beyond the first few battles. The cost was simply too high. The Velcor had been a warrior race with proud traditions spanning millennia, but they fell in 6 months after Kazrath glassed their 3 largest cities from orbit. The Methodians were beings of living crystal who could communicate faster than light across their network of colony worlds, but they surrendered when Kazrath shattered their home planet into asteroids. The aquatic Prin had vast oceans on 15 worlds and technology that could create tsunamis powerful enough to reshape continents, but they signed treaties of submission before Kazrath fired a single weapon at their core systems. Ben Hughes listened to the briefing from his position, near the back of the room where the junior officers gathered to absorb information that would soon become orders. He commanded a small frigate called the Valiant, and his crew of 43 men and women represented one tiny piece of Earth's defensive fleet. The numbers that Admiral Carter was presenting made his stomach turn cold. Humanity had been aware of alien life for only 12 years, and in that time they had built 300 ships capable of faster-than-light travel and combat in the void of space. Kazrath's fleet numbered over 2,000 vessels, and each one carried weapons that had been refined through centuries of conquest. Amy Sullivan stood next to Ben, and her fingers moved rapidly across her datapad as she took notes on everything the Admiral said. She was the tactical officer aboard the Valiant, and she had spent the last 6 months studying every scrap of information humanity had gathered about Kazrath's methods. The pattern she saw was clear but troubling. Kazrath never lost because he never allowed himself to be surprised. He studied his enemies carefully before attacking, and he always knew exactly how much force to apply to break their will without wasting resources. He was efficient and cold, and utterly without mercy for those who made him work harder than necessary. President Richard Cole appeared on a secondary screen, and his face was broadcast to every military installation and government facility across Earth and its colonies. His words were simple and direct because there was no point in soft language when the threat was so immediate. Humanity would not surrender. They would not negotiate for terms that would make them subjects of an alien empire. They would stand and fight even if every computer, simulation, and tactical analysis predicted their complete defeat within weeks of the first engagement. Dr. Laura Bennett sat in her laboratory deep beneath the surface of Earth and reviewed data that most people would never see because it was too disturbing for public consumption. She had made xenopsychology her life's work in the brief time since humanity learned it was not alone in the universe, and now she studied the psychological profiles of every species Kazrath had conquered. The pattern was clear, and it was exactly what she had feared. Kazrath broke civilizations mentally before he destroyed them physically. He made them believe that resistance was impossible, and that surrender was the only rational choice. Every species that faced him showed the same progression, from defiance to despair to submission. But Laura had found something else in the data, and it gave her a thin thread of hope even as it revealed a dangerous truth. Every species Kazrath conquered had been defeated primarily through space combat and the threat of orbital bombardment. He would blockade a world and demonstrate his power to destroy cities from above, and the species below would calculate the mathematics of extinction versus submission. No one had ever forced him to fight a prolonged ground war. No one had ever made him come down to the surface and take territory meter by meter. Perhaps no one had ever been desperate enough or determined enough to try. On Titan's largest moon in the outer reaches of humanity's territory, Ben Hughes supervised the evacuation of the mining colony that had been home to 15,000 people for the last 8 years. The massive transport ships filled their holds with civilians who carried whatever belongings they could manage in the rush to escape. Everyone knew that Kazrath's forward scouts would reach this region within weeks, and Ben had been ordered to save as many lives as possible before pulling back to more defensible positions. Each person who boarded the transports represented a small victory against the darkness that was coming, but Ben could see the fear in their eyes as they looked. Back at the homes they were leaving behind, Jake Morrison reviewed the tactical simulations one more time in his private quarters where no one could see the despair that threatened to overwhelm him. Every scenario ended the same way. Earth's fleet would engage Kazrath's armada somewhere in the outer system. The battle would last between 4 and 9 hours depending on how aggressively the human forces fought. Then the fleet would be destroyed and Earth would be defenseless. The simulations gave humanity a 3% chance of destroying more than 100 enemy ships before the end. 3%. That was what 300 years of conquest had created. An enemy so dominant that survival itself seemed like victory. But something stirred in Jake's mind as he watched the simulations run their predictable course. Every defeated species had surrendered after calculating that survival through submission was preferable to extinction through resistance. The mathematics were simple and cold, but mathematics assumed that survival was the highest value. What if it was not? What if humanity chose to value freedom over survival? The simulations could not account for that variable, because it was fundamentally irrational. You could not defeat a superior force through determination alone, except that determination changed the equation in ways that pure military analysis could not measure. Amy Sullivan made her report to Admiral Carter in the privacy of the command center after the main briefing had concluded. She had found something in Kazrath's battle records that might be significant, or might be nothing at all. In 300 years of conquest, Kazrath had never lost a ship to ramming. No species had ever been desperate enough or determined enough to deliberately sacrifice their vessels in close-range collisions. The tactic was suicide and it violated every principle of military efficiency. But it would work. Amy ran the numbers and she knew that a human ship driving itself into an enemy vessel at full speed would destroy both craft completely. It was wasteful and desperate, and it would absolutely work if anyone was willing to pay the price. Admiral Carter listened to Amy's analysis, and then she made a decision that would ripple through everything that followed. She sent orders to every ship captain in the fleet. If the choice came down to retreat or ramming, they were authorized to make their own decisions. Earth would not order its defenders to die, but it would not stop them from choosing to do so if they believed it was necessary. That choice, that terrible freedom to decide the value of their own lives against the cost to the enemy, changed something fundamental in how humanity would face the coming war. The word spread through the fleet and the colonies and the government centers on Earth itself. Humanity would not surrender. The mathematics of the situation did not matter. The historical precedent did not matter. What mattered was the choice to stand unbroken even if standing meant falling. It was irrational and desperate, and it was the only choice that felt like remaining human. The first ships of Kazrath's forward fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the New Horizon system, and their arrival sent shockwaves through every sensor array. Humanity had positioned in the outer colonies. Chris Palmer stood on the bridge of the destroyer Relentless and watched the enemy vessels materialize on his tactical display, like predators emerging from dark water. He commanded Battle Group 7, which consisted of 12 ships ranging from small frigates to his own destroyer, and they represented humanity's first line of defense against an enemy that had never known defeat. The alien vessels were massive and brutal in their design, with hulls that seemed designed to intimidate as much as to protect. They moved with perfect coordination as if connected by invisible threads of communication, and their weapon systems powered up with an efficiency that spoke of centuries of practice. Chris gave the order to engage, and Battle Group 7 accelerated toward the enemy formation at maximum combat speed. His crew moved with precision born of endless drills, but nothing could truly prepare anyone for the moment when theoretical training became actual combat. The space between the two fleets, filled with energy weapons and missile trails, and the silent fury of modern warfare conducted in the void where no sound could travel. The first human ship to die was a frigate called the Denver, and it simply ceased to exist when 3 alien beam weapons intersected at its position. There was a brief flash of light, and then nothing remained except expanding debris. The second ship lasted longer before its reactor went critical, and turned the vessel into a miniature sun that briefly outshone the distant stars. Within 20 minutes, 7 human ships had been destroyed, and Chris knew with absolute certainty that Battle Group 7 could not win this fight. But winning was not the only objective, and Chris had his orders. Admiral Carter had been clear that the first engagement was about gathering data as much as it was about inflicting damage. Every sensor on every human ship was recording everything about how the enemy fought. Their tactics, their weapon ranges, their response times, their formation patterns, all of it was being transmitted back to Earth in real-time data streams that would help humanity prepare for the battles to come. If Battle Group 7 died here, at least their deaths would serve a purpose. Nicole Warren sat at her tactical station aboard the frigate Portland and watched her displays fill with target locks and threat warnings. She was 26 years old, and she had joined the Space Navy because she wanted to explore the galaxy, and instead she was about to die fighting an enemy she had never wanted to meet. The Portland shuddered as enemy fire overwhelmed its shields and tore into the hull plating. Alarms screamed through the corridors, and Nicole heard the captain ordering everyone to evacuation pods. She grabbed her emergency kit and ran toward the nearest pod bay as the ship began to break apart around her. Chris Palmer made his decision in the moment between one heartbeat and the next. The Relentless was dying, and he had lost 11 of his 12 ships, and nothing they had done seemed to even slow the enemy advance. But Amy Sullivan's analysis was correct. Ramming would work. He dismissed his bridge crew and ordered them to the escape pods, and then he sat alone in his command chair and aimed his dying ship directly at the largest enemy vessel. The Relentless accelerated on its final course, and Chris closed his eyes as the distance shrank to nothing. The collision destroyed both ships instantly and for the first time in 40 years. Warlord Kazrath lost a vessel in combat. The debris field expanded in all directions, and within it, Nicole's escape pod tumbled through space with its automated distress beacon broadcasting continuously. She had survived the destruction of the Portland, but now she was alone in hostile territory with limited life support and no way to reach friendly forces. The pod systems were designed for recovery within hours, but Nicole knew that no human ships would be coming back to this system anytime soon. She tried not to think about dying slowly in the cold dark as her oxygen ran out. 12 hours later, a salvage ship approached Nicole's pod, and its design was clearly alien but not the same as Kazrath's warships. The vessel docked with her pod, and Nicole prepared herself for whatever came next as the airlock cycled open. The being that entered was tall and thin, with gray skin and large dark eyes that seemed too big for its narrow face. It wore a uniform marked with symbols Nicole did not recognize, but its body language suggested caution rather than aggression. The alien spoke in a language Nicole could not understand, but then it pressed a small device to her temple, and suddenly, the sounds it made began to resolve into words. The Bayan alien's name was Thros, and he belonged to the Velcor species that had fallen to Kazrath 70 years ago. He was an engineer on a salvage vessel, crewed by conquered peoples who served Kazrath's empire not from loyalty, but from lack of any other choice. Thros explained that he had picked up Nicole's distress signal and made the decision to investigate against orders because he was curious about the species that had destroyed one of Kazrath's ships. In 70 years of service, Thros had never seen anyone damage Kazrath's fleet, and he wanted to know what kind of beings would sacrifice themselves so completely. Nicole told Thros about humanity and about Earth and about the choice her species had made to fight rather than surrender. She told him about Chris Palmer, who had rammed his ship into the enemy because dying free was better than living enslaved. Thros listened with an expression that Nicole could not read, but she sensed something shifting in how the alien regarded her. Perhaps it was respect, or perhaps it was something closer to wonder at the idea that a species might choose extinction over submission. On Earth, the military council reviewed the data from the Battle of New Horizon, and the mood was grim, despite the small victory of the destroyed enemy ship. General Frank Morris presented his analysis, and the numbers were clear. Humanity could not win a conventional war against Kazrath's fleet. Every engagement would be a defeat, and while they might inflict casualties through desperate tactics, the mathematics of attrition favored the enemy. Humanity needed a different approach, and Frank proposed something that went against every instinct of military tradition. Instead of defending every colony and every position, humanity should evacuate populations and turn their colonies into traps. Major Katie Preston volunteered to lead the first guerrilla operation before Frank had even finished explaining his plan. She was a combat veteran who had trained in every environment from desert to Arctic, and she understood immediately what Frank was proposing. If humanity could not win in space, they would make Khazrath fight on the ground. They would hide weapons and supplies in asteroid fields and abandoned stations. They would turn every colony into a potential ambush site. They would make the enemy pay for every meter of territory, with blood and time and resources until the cost of conquest outweighed the value. Admiral Carter approved the plan with the full knowledge that it meant writing off huge sections of human territory. Colonies that had taken decades to build would be abandoned or booby-trapped. Millions of people would become refugees fleeing inward toward Earth. The economic cost would be staggering and the psychological impact would be severe, but the alternative was extinction, and Linda Carter had not joined the military to preside over the extinction of her species. She gave the orders and the Great Retreat began. Khazrath himself reviewed the recordings of the Battle of New Horizon from his command ship deep in the heart of his fleet. He watched the human vessel accelerate toward his heavy cruiser, and he saw the moment of impact that destroyed both ships. His tactical officers expected rage at the loss, but instead Khazrath felt something closer to interest. In 300 years he had faced desperate courage many times. Species often fought bravely in their first battles before reality crushed their spirit. The question was whether humanity would be different, or whether they would follow the same pattern as all the others. Time would provide the answer. The enemy fleet continued its advance toward human space, and Khazrath ordered his forces to move more slowly and deliberately than usual. He wanted humanity to feel the weight of his approach. He wanted them to calculate the mathematics of their situation and understand that resistance would only increase their suffering. Every species eventually accepted this truth, and Khazrath had no reason to believe humans would be an exception, regardless of their early show of determination. But in the slave quarters of Khazrath's factory worlds and aboard the conquered vessels that served his fleet, something had begun to stir. Thras shared Nicole's story with other Velcor, and they passed it to the Methodians who transmitted it to the Prin. The story was simple but profound. A species existed that chose death over slavery. A commander had destroyed his own ship to damage the enemy. Perhaps Khazrath was not invincible after all. Perhaps the mathematics that said resistance was futile were missing some variable that humanity understood. The conquered peoples did not rebel yet, but they began to remember that they had once been free. 8 months of continuous retreat had transformed humanity's defensive strategy from organized military resistance into something that resembled controlled chaos. Commander Paul Sanders stood in the ruins of what had been a thriving mining station in the Epsilon sector and surveyed the demolition charges his team had placed throughout the facility. Every piece of equipment that could not be evacuated would be destroyed. Every fuel depot would become a bomb. Every docking bay would collapse into twisted metal when Khazrath's forces arrived to claim their prize. The station had cost billions to construct over 15 years, and it would cease to exist in approximately 4 hours. Sergeant Ryan Cooper checked the timers on the final set of charges while Sergeant Sophie Turner monitored the approach of enemy scout ships on her portable sensor array. The 3 of them represented the last human presence on the station, and their escape window was closing rapidly. Ryan had been a demolitions expert in Earth's military before humanity learned it shared the galaxy with aggressive neighbors, and now his skills were being applied to destroying humanity's own infrastructure. The irony was not lost on him, but he focused on the technical work because thinking too deeply about the broader situation made it hard to function. Sophie called out a warning that the enemy scouts were accelerating their approach, and the 3 soldiers ran for their extraction ship with seconds to spare. The small vessel cleared the station's perimeter, just as the first demolition charges began to detonate, and Paul watched through the rear cameras as the facility tore itself apart in a series of expanding fireballs. One more human outpost reduced to debris. One more small denial of resources to an enemy that seemed to have infinite reserves. The mathematics still favored Khazrath, but humanity was learning to make every calculation more expensive. Back on Earth, Dr. Laura Bennett presented her findings to a special session of the Military Council, and her voice carried a mixture of hope and warning. She had analyzed 8 months of intercepted communications from Khazrath's fleet, and she had identified a pattern that most military analysts had missed. The conquered species serving Khazrath were becoming less efficient. Response times were slower. Equipment failures were more frequent. Orders were being fulfilled with less precision than the records from earlier campaigns showed. The changes were subtle but consistent, and Laura believed she knew the cause. Humanity's refusal to surrender was inspiring doubt in an empire built on the certainty of Khazrath's inevitable victory. Admiral Carter listened to Laura's presentation and understood immediately what it meant for humanity's strategy going forward. The war was not just about destroying enemy ships or defending territory. It was about breaking the psychological foundation of Khazrath's empire. Every battle humanity fought, every small victory they achieved, every day they continued to resist sent a message to 47 star systems full of conquered peoples. The message was simple but revolutionary. Khazrath could be defied. Submission was not inevitable. Freedom was worth fighting, for even against impossible odds. The Admiral approved Operation Echo, which would broadcast humanity's story across every communication channel that could reach Khazrath's territory. Every battle would be recorded and transmitted. Every human stand would become propaganda. Every small victory would be amplified and shared. The goal was not just to fight Khazrath's military, but to undermine the certainty that held his empire together. Linda knew it was a desperate strategy, but desperation had become humanity's primary resource in a war they could not win through conventional means. On Mars, civilian engineer Greg Wallace worked 20-hour days designing and building the new generation of space mines that would become humanity's primary defensive weapon. The mines were small enough to hide in asteroid debris and sophisticated enough to distinguish between human and alien vessels. They could remain dormant for months and activate in microseconds when enemy ships approached. Greg had been a pacifist before the war, and he still struggled with the knowledge that his designs would kill thousands of beings who might have been forced into service against their will. But the alternative was allowing those same beings to kill humans, and Greg had made his choice. Teacher Kelly Brooks stood before a class of new recruits at the Ray training facility outside the Mars capital and taught them the basics of operating in zero-gravity combat conditions. She had been an elementary school teacher who loved working with children and helping them discover their potential. Now she trained young soldiers who needed to learn how to kill efficiently before they were shipped out to defensive positions across the inner system. Kelly sometimes woke from nightmares where her old students looked at her with accusation in their eyes, but she pushed through. The guilt because someone had to prepare the next generation for the reality they faced. Paul Sanders survived the destruction of the Epsilon station, but his team did not. A follow-up mission to disable an enemy supply convoy ran into an ambush, and Ryan Cooper died buying time for Paul and Sophie to reach their extraction point. Sophie took a weapon hit that her suit could not fully protect against, and she bled out in Paul's arms during the flight back to friendly space. He delivered his mission report to the intelligence officers with a voice that sounded hollow even to himself, and then he requested immediate reassignment because stopping to grieve would mean accepting that his friends had died for a cause that might ultimately fail. Jake Morrison commanded the defense of a small orbital station that guarded one of the approach vectors to Earth, and he had not slept more than 4 hours at a stretch in the past 3 months. Every day brought new reports of enemy movements, and every night brought the possibility of attack. His crew operated in a state of permanent exhaustion, held together by stimulants and determination. They knew their station would not survive if Khazrath's main fleet reached this sector, but they held their position anyway because every day they delayed, the enemy was another day for Earth to prepare. Ben Hughes led a squadron of light frigates in a running battle through the ice fields of the Kuiper Belt and used the terrain to offset the enemy's numerical superiority. His ships would emerge from behind frozen comets to fire brief salvos before disappearing back into cover. The tactic was exhausting and stressful, and it could not inflict decisive damage, but it forced Khazrath's fleet to move slowly and carefully through a region they should have traversed in days. Ben lost 2 ships in 6 weeks of hit-and-run operations, but his squadron destroyed 7 enemy vessels and damaged a dozen more. The mathematics were still terrible, but they were slowly becoming less impossible. Amy Sullivan coordinated intelligence from across all human forces and built a comprehensive picture of Khazrath's fleet movements and tactical patterns. She worked from a bunker deep beneath Earth's surface where the walls were lined with screens showing data streams from thousands of sources. Amy had discovered something important in the patterns. Khazrath was becoming frustrated. His advance was taking longer than any previous conquest. His casualties were higher than projections had predicted. His subjugated species were showing signs of reduced morale and efficiency. The Warlord was beginning to make small mistakes in his tactical decisions, and small mistakes could become larger vulnerabilities. If humanity could find the right pressure points, Nicole. Warren returned to human space after 4 months in captivity, and her intelligence proved invaluable. Thros had hidden her aboard his salvage ship and gradually gained the trust of his fellow Velcor, who had then connected her with members of other conquered species. Nicole learned about the internal structure of Khazrath's empire and about the growing network of quiet resistance that was forming among the subjugated peoples. She also learned the location of Khazrath's command ship and the patterns of his personal movements. Most importantly, she confirmed what Dr. Bennett had theorized. The conquered species were waiting for a sign that rebellion was possible. They needed proof that Khazrath could be truly defeated before they would risk open resistance. The military council debated how to use Nicole's intelligence, and the discussion revealed deep divisions about humanity's strategic direction. Some argued for a direct strike against Khazrath's command ship, using every resource humanity could marshal. Others believed that such an attack would fail and waste forces needed for Earth's defense. General Morris proposed a compromise. Humanity would continue its defensive retreat, while simultaneously supporting the underground resistance movements in Khazrath's territory. They would provide weapons and tactical intelligence to any conquered species willing to fight. The goal was to turn Khazrath's empire against itself while humanity bought time through stubborn resistance. 3 months before Khazrath's projected arrival at Earth, Admiral Carter gave a speech that was broadcast to every human military unit and civilian population center. She spoke about the 8 months of retreat and the terrible cost humanity had paid in lives and territory. She acknowledged that the mathematics still predicted defeat, but she also spoke about what humanity had accomplished. They had survived longer than any species in Khazrath's 300-year history of conquest. They had inspired hope in 47 star systems of enslaved peoples. They had proven that determination could change equations that pure. The battle for Earth began not with a single decisive engagement, but with 1,000 small conflicts scattered across the outer system as Khazrath's fleet encountered the defensive network humanity had spent 8 months preparing. Jake Morrison commanded the forward sensor station that detected the enemy's arrival, and his report triggered alerts across every human military installation from the Kuiper Belt to Mars orbit. The final battle had begun, and everyone knew that the next few weeks would determine whether humanity survived as a free species or became another entry in Khazrath's catalog of conquests. Admiral Carter stood in the command center deep beneath Earth's surface and watched the tactical displays fill with red icons representing enemy ships. Her defensive plan was unconventional and desperate, but conventional warfare had already proven futile against Khazrath's superior numbers and technology. Instead of massing humanity's remaining 300 ships for a single fleet engagement, Linda had scattered them throughout the solar system in small groups that could strike and fade before the enemy could respond effectively. The strategy sacrificed coordination for flexibility, and it turned Earth's own territory into a maze of potential ambushes. Ben Hughes took his squadron into the asteroid belt where millions of rocks, ranging from pebbles to mountains, provided cover and concealment. His 5 frigates separated and took up positions behind large asteroids, while their sensors tracked enemy formations passing through the belt. When a group of 20 alien ships entered the kill zone, Ben gave the signal and all 5 frigates opened fire simultaneously from different angles. The ambush destroyed 3 enemy vessels and damaged 5 more before Ben's squadron scattered back into the maze of asteroids. The enemy pursued, but they moved cautiously. Now, because the belt had become hostile territory where every shadow might hide human ships, Lieutenant Dan Foster flew a fighter that had been patched and repaired so many times that its original specifications were barely recognizable. He led a wing of 30 fighters in a desperate attack against an enemy formation near Jupiter's orbit, and the dogfight that followed tested every skill Dan had learned in 2 years of combat. His fighters were smaller and more maneuverable than the enemy craft, but they were also more fragile and less heavily armed. Dan lost 12 pilots in the first 5 minutes of combat, but the survivors managed to cripple 2 enemy cruisers before retreating toward the cover of Jupiter's massive radiation belts. On Mars, Major Julie Sanders commanded the defense of the orbital stations that protected the planet's civilian population. Her forces consisted of a mixture of regular military units and civilian volunteers who had learned to fight because there was no other choice. Julie had spent 3 months turning the orbital platforms into fortresses, with overlapping fields of fire and reinforced armor plating. When the enemy attacked, her defenders held their positions through wave after wave of assault despite casualties that would have broken most military formations. The stations held because retreat meant abandoning Mars to bombardment, and no one was willing to accept that cost. Nicole Warren had been promoted to intelligence liaison, and she worked directly with Admiral Carter to coordinate the broader defensive strategy. The information she had gathered during her captivity was proving invaluable as human forces identified and exploited weaknesses in Kazrath's tactical patterns. Nicole also maintained secret communications with Thros and other sympathetic members of conquered species, serving in Kazrath's fleet. Those communications revealed growing discontent and confusion among the subjugated peoples who could not understand why the humans continued fighting when defeat seemed certain. Nicole passed messages encouraging patience and promising that humanity's stand would create opportunities for broader resistance. Dr. Laura Bennett monitored the psychological dimensions of the battle from her research facility, and what she saw both encouraged and terrified her. Humanity's continued resistance was having exactly the effect she had predicted on Kazrath's empire. Efficiency continued to decline among conquered species. Communication intercepts showed increasing discussions of human determination and rumors of possible rebellion. But Laura also saw the cost the war was exacting on humanity itself. Casualty rates were staggering. Entire colonies had been evacuated or destroyed. The psychological trauma of living under constant threat was creating mental health crises across all human populations. Humanity was winning the propaganda war while losing the military conflict, and Laura could not predict which factor would prove decisive. Kazrath stood on the bridge of his command ship and felt an emotion he had not experienced in decades. Frustration. The conquest of Earth should have taken 3 weeks according to all historical patterns and tactical analysis. Instead, 6 months had passed and the humans continued fighting with a ferocity that made every advance costly. His fleet had lost over 300 ships to an enemy that should have been swept aside with minimal effort. The subjugated species serving his empire were showing signs of doubt and decreased efficiency. Kazrath's own commanders were beginning to question his tactical decisions. All of this because one species refused to accept the mathematical reality of their situation. The Warlord made his decision with the cold certainty that had guided 3 centuries of conquest. He would not continue this grinding war of attrition in space. Instead, he would take his personal fleet to Earth's surface and occupy the human capital cities. He would demonstrate that his power extended beyond orbital bombardment. He would break the human will through direct confrontation and occupation. It was what he had done to the Velcor when space superiority alone had not been enough. It was what he had done to 3 other species whose homeworlds required ground operations. The pattern always worked because ground warfare allowed him to apply pressure directly to civilian populations, and no species could maintain resistance when their cities were occupied and their people were hostages. Commander Alex Miller received Admiral Carter's orders with grim satisfaction because he had been preparing for exactly this scenario. As soon as Kazrath committed to ground operations, the nature of the war would change in ways that favored humanity's strengths. Alex commanded the global defense network that had turned every major city on Earth into a fortress. Underground bunkers, hidden weapon caches, tunnel systems that allowed defenders to move beneath the surface. Every civilian had been trained in basic combat and evacuation procedures. Earth itself had become a weapon, waiting to be triggered. The landing began 3 days after Kazrath made his decision in the sight of alien. Dropships descending through Earth's atmosphere sent waves of fear and determination through the human population. The enemy chose to land near the ruins of what had been New York before the preliminary orbital bombardment that preceded ground operations. The city had been evacuated weeks earlier, and now it stood empty and silent as Kazrath's forces established their landing zones and began deploying ground troops. The aliens expected resistance, but what they encountered was eerie quiet as they advanced into the abandoned streets. Sergeant Danny Price waited in a subway tunnel beneath Manhattan with 200 soldiers and enough firepower to destroy several city blocks. His orders were clear. Wait until the enemy committed significant forces to the city center, and then spring the trap. Danny had been a police officer before the war, and he understood urban warfare in ways that military academy training could not fully replicate. The city was his terrain, and he knew every hiding place and every angle of fire. When the enemy reached the predetermined kill zone, Danny gave the signal and the city came alive with violence. Explosions ripped through the streets as hidden charges detonated beneath enemy formations. Automated weapon systems emerged from concealed positions in buildings and began firing with mechanical precision. Human soldiers appeared from subway entrances and building interiors to attack enemy flanks before disappearing back underground. The aliens found themselves fighting an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere as the trap closed around them. Khazrath had expected resistance, but not this level of preparation, and certainly not this degree of ferocity from a species that should have been demoralized by months of defeat. Private Emma Collins was 20 years old and terrified, beyond anything she had imagined possible, but she kept fighting because everyone around her kept fighting, and stopping seemed worse than continuing. She fired her weapon at alien soldiers advancing down a street and saw several fall before enemy return fire forced her to take cover. Emma's squad leader was killed in the first 5 minutes of combat, and she found herself giving orders to soldiers who were just as scared and inexperienced as she was. They held their position for 3 hours before rotating back to secondary defensive lines, and Emma realized with shock that they had actually pushed the enemy back several blocks. Jacob Lee was a medic who treated wounded soldiers in a field hospital set up in a subway station while the battle raged overhead. He had joined the medical corps because he wanted to save lives, and now he worked in blood-soaked conditions treating injuries that would have been fatal without immediate intervention. Jacob saved dozens of lives that day, but he also watched people die despite his best efforts, and each death. Khazrath stood in the command center of his ground base and watched tactical displays that showed something he had never experienced in 300 years of conquest. His forces were not advancing. The humans had turned their capital into a labyrinth of death where every street corner might hide an ambush, and every building might explode without warning. His soldiers reported fighting an enemy that refused to hold static positions and instead flowed through the urban terrain like water through cracks. Conventional ground warfare doctrine assumed that superior firepower and numbers would eventually overwhelm defensive positions, but the humans were not defending positions in any traditional sense. They were defending the entire city as a single integrated weapon system. Admiral Carter received reports from the surface battle and made the decision that would determine everything that followed. With Khazrath's fleet committed to ground operations and his command ship in low orbit to coordinate the surface assault, humanity's space forces had an opportunity that would never come again. Linda gave orders for every available ship to converge on Khazrath's orbital position. It was a desperate gamble that would leave other sectors undefended, but the Admiral understood that killing or capturing Khazrath was worth almost any cost. If the Warlord fell, his empire might collapse. If he escaped, the opportunity would be lost forever. Ben Hughes brought his squadron out of the asteroid belt at maximum speed with every reactor pushed beyond safe limits. His 5 frigates had been reduced to 3 during months of hit-and-run warfare, but the survivors were crewed by veterans who had learned to operate their damaged vessels with desperate efficiency. Ben's target was not Khazrath's command ship directly, but rather the screening vessels that protected it. If the screen could be broken, heavier human warships could get clear shots at the primary target. Ben knew his frigates would not survive the attack, but survival had stopped being the primary objective months ago. Chris Palmer had died in the first battle of the war, but his example lived on in pilots like Lieutenant Dan Foster, who flew his damaged fighter in the final assault on Khazrath's fleet. Dan's fighter had lost its main weapons and most of its armor, but it could still fly and it could still ram. He aimed his vessel at an enemy cruiser that was moving to intercept the human capital ships, and he thought about Chris Palmer as the distance closed. The collision destroyed both craft and opened a gap in the enemy formation that human destroyers exploited immediately. On the ground, Sergeant Danny Price led a counterattack that retook 3 city blocks from alien occupation. His forces moved through subway tunnels to emerge behind enemy lines, and the surprise was total. The aliens had not expected humans to attack while defending, and the confusion allowed Danny's forces to inflict casualties far beyond what their numbers should have achieved. Danny himself was wounded in the final push, but he stayed on his feet long enough to see the enemy retreating from positions they had held for hours. It was a small victory in a massive battle, but small victories were adding up to something larger. Private Emma Collins found herself promoted to squad leader after 3 more. Experienced soldiers died in rapid succession. She led her new squad in defensive operations that turned a major intersection into a killing ground, where enemy forces could not advance without taking prohibitive casualties. Emma was terrified and exhausted and running on stimulants that made her hands shake, but she kept giving orders and her squad kept following them because everyone was too focused on immediate survival to think about broader questions of success or failure. They held their position for 16 hours before being relieved by fresh units. Jacob Lee treated over 200 wounded soldiers during the battle, and his medical supplies ran out after the first 8 hours. He began improvising with materials never intended for medical use, while other medics shared equipment and medications in a desperate effort to keep the wounded alive long enough for evacuation. Jacob saved lives that should have been lost, and he knew that many of the soldiers he treated would be back in combat within days. The thought should have been depressing, but instead it filled him with fierce pride because survival meant resistance continued, and continued resistance was the only victory that mattered. In orbit, Admiral Carter's gamble paid off in ways that exceeded her most optimistic projections. The concentrated human attack overwhelmed Kazrath's screening forces, and 3 human destroyers penetrated to firing range of the command ship. The battle that followed lasted only minutes, but those minutes changed everything. Captain Chris Palmer's sacrifice in the first battle had shown that ramming worked, and now dozens of human ships demonstrated that lesson again. The command ship's shields failed under sustained fire, and its hull breached in multiple locations. Kazrath survived the initial damage, but his ship was crippled and losing altitude as it began an uncontrolled descent toward Earth's surface. Nicole Warren watched from the intelligence center as the impossible happened. Kazrath's command ship was falling. Across the enemy fleet, confusion spread as subordinate commanders tried to understand what had occurred and adjust their tactics without central coordination. But something else was happening simultaneously. The conquered species that served Kazrath's fleet were receiving reports that the Warlord's ship had been destroyed. Those reports were not entirely accurate, but accuracy mattered less than perception. Thros and other members of the underground resistance network began spreading the word that Kazrath was dead, and his empire was finished. The rebellion began in the engine rooms and cargo bays where conquered peoples worked under the supervision of Kazrath's loyal species. A Velcor engineer named Thros was the first to act when he sabotaged the power systems of his ship and locked the command crew out of critical systems. His action inspired others. Methodian technicians shut down weapon systems. Prin navigators fed false coordinates to their ships. Within hours, dozens of vessels in Kazrath's fleet were experiencing cascading system failures that had nothing to do with human weapons and everything to do with 300 years of resentment finally finding an outlet. General Frank Morris coordinated the ground response to Kazrath's ship crash, and human forces converged on the impact site with orders to capture the Warlord alive if possible. The crash had occurred in what had been a residential district, and the destruction was extensive. Kazrath survived the impact, but he was injured and his personal guard was scattered. When human soldiers surrounded his position, the Warlord, who had never known defeat, faced the species that had refused to surrender. Lieutenant Nicole Warren was present at the capture because she had earned the right through her months of captivity and intelligence work. She looked into Kazrath's eyes and saw something she had not expected. Confusion rather than hatred or rage. The Warlord genuinely did not understand how this had happened. The war did not end immediately with Kazrath's capture, but it ended quickly. Across 47 star systems, conquered peoples rose against their overseers when they learned that the invincible Warlord had been defeated by a species that fought with nothing but determination and refusal to surrender. Some of Kazrath's loyal forces fought on, but they were isolated and outnumbered by rebellions they had never prepared to face. Within 3 weeks, the empire that had taken 3 centuries to build collapsed into fragments, as freed peoples reclaimed their worlds and their sovereignty. Commander Jake Morrison stood in the ruins of New York and looked at the devastation that surrounded him. The city was destroyed. Billions of humans had died during the war. The economic and psychological costs would take generations to overcome. But humanity stood unbroken, and that fact mattered more than any calculation of material loss. Other species were sending delegations to Earth to meet the people who had proven that resistance was possible. The galaxy would never be the same because one species had chosen freedom over survival and had somehow achieved both. Admiral Linda Carter addressed the survivors in a speech that was broadcast across Earth and its colonies. She spoke about the cost of victory and the responsibility that came with it. Humanity had not fought this war to become conquerors themselves. They had fought to remain free, and now they had an obligation to help other species achieve the same freedom. The Admiral's words were simple and direct. We won not because we were stronger, but because we refused to accept defeat. That refusal changed the mathematics of power in ways that pure military force could never achieve. Dr. Laura Bennett wrote her final report on the psychological dimensions of the war, and her conclusions would influence military and diplomatic thinking for decades. She argued that Khazrath's empire had fallen not primarily because of military defeat, but because its psychological foundation was fundamentally fragile. An empire built on the certainty of inevitable victory could not survive sustained resistance that proved victory was not inevitable. Humanity's determination had exposed that fragility and created space for conquered peoples to imagine rebellion. The lesson was clear. Freedom could not be taken by force from people willing to die to preserve it. Khazrath faced trial for war crimes, and the proceedings were attended by representatives from all 47 formerly conquered species. When asked why he had failed to defeat humanity,